Hi, I'm Paco Nathan, and I'm here to present about a survey that we conducted recently. This was done by Ben Lorca and myself through Gradient Flow. It was published on September 21st, so very recent. And also, the survey was sponsored by John Snow Labs. Now, as far as our background, what we were trying to accomplish through the survey, the intent is to understand how NLP technologies are being used in industry today. The survey ran during the summer from July, August, about 41 days. And we had going towards 600 respondents from over 50 different countries. People were mostly recruited through some online channels, but also through partnerships, contacts, etc. And I definitely want to shout out to our colleagues, Kathy Yu and Jen Webb, for vital contributions preparing the survey and the report. Now, we structured this survey in a special way. We wanted to be able to understand a contrast study, be able to compare and contrast between a few important considerations. Number one, what's the delta between people who are practitioners who have years of experience deploying NLP in production versus people who are just really more exploring the area. Also, what's the delta between people who are in technical leadership roles versus general respondents? And then a few other dimensions: company size, scale of documents, geographic region. It's notable that out of the respondents, we had 1/4 who are in some form of technical leadership role. So the sample provides a good representation of how business decisions are being made about technology adoption for NLP in industry. In terms of demographics, you can see the breakdown here is a lot of people from technology firms, definitely. Also a lot of healthcare, financial services, and you see other representation down the list in terms of education, food and agriculture, et cetera. But really the top three there are technology, healthcare, finance. And in terms of location, it was interesting. We had a lot of people responding from Asia, and then breakdown in Western Hemisphere and EMEA. The 1%, I'm not sure, maybe Antarctica. Now, in terms of who's really answering here, I mentioned about the representation of technical leadership. We had 1/4 of the respondents who are in some form of hands-on technical role, but we also had a lot of people who were architects, and then you add that with the technical leaders, you get almost 60% who have some professional work in technology in industry. So again, representative of what's going on there. In terms of stage of maturity, it's a split, really. It's really interesting that, well, we had 44% who are NLP practitioners who have some years doing this versus 56 who are exploring NLP. And I think that contrast study is super interesting because it helps us understand where are some of the pain points for people who are just getting started versus once you really get into this, what are your pain points then? In terms of company size and scale of documents, these had the same split, 24, 59, 17. So basically for large, medium, and small, they seem to be tracking each other pretty well, and they're relatively representative of what's aggregate going on in industry in general. I don't really have time in the talk to go through all the highlights. There's a lot of analysis in the report. It's a free download, so definitely go check that out. We'll cover some of the main highlights here, though. And one of the bigger takeaways is that budgets are growing. If you look year over year compared to 2019, we're seeing budget growth. This is definitely represented a lot in enterprise. It's being reported by people in technical leadership roles. So that's a strong signal. So for technical leaders, 53% are saying their budgets have grown year over year by 10% or more. 12% say that their budgets more than doubled. That's very strong for NLP in industry. Good to see. In terms of the use cases, again, very strong signal here from both the technical leadership as well as the NLP practitioners reporting roughly the same thing. The 4 top use cases are document classification, NER, named entity recognition, sentiment analysis, and then knowledge graph work. And I should also add that if you're in healthcare, a close fifth is de-identification as a common use case. In terms of libraries, particularly open source libraries for this, is interesting. We see a breakdown of 1/3 using Spark NLP in production, 1/4 using Spacey in production, a half use either of those put together. And then down the list you see Allen NLP. It's more research focused, but there have been industry integrations, for instance, in Biome, their NLTK, Stanford Core, etc. And definitely from a personal perspective, a lot of people probably will recognize my previous work as the evangelist for Apache Spark, open source evangelist. But in my day-to-day life, our firm does work with Spacey for clients. I'm a committer on a pipeline extension for Spacey. In terms of cloud services, in contrast to the open source libraries, we're getting a signal there. Roughly 2/3 of both the technical leaders and the NLP practitioners are reporting about that they use at least one NLP related cloud service. And you can start to see the breakdown here. Definitely I get the sense that people who are just exploring NLP are probably leaning more on the cloud, and people who are more initiated, probably less so. In terms of data sources in general, we like to track what are the main kinds of cases of data sources there, because that has a lot of bearing on how pipeline is built. Files and also text fields from database, these are the top ones. And that's pretty consistent with what we've seen in previous surveys. Definitely, there's a lot of online content being crawled. If you're working with PDFs, speaking of online content, a lot of times, even though the libraries for parsing PDFs have really come up in the world thanks to deep learning models, there's still a long ways to go. PDF is a very problematic format. In a lot of cases, it's going to be more cost effective just to scan them and then run OCR. And there's a fair amount of speech to text that definitely seems to be rising up, but not at the top yet. And for me, looking at the contrast in terms of stage of maturity and how much expertise you have, this is one that stuck out for me as being one of the contrast takeaways. Basically, if you're a practitioner, you have years of hands-on doing NLP in production, it's a lot of return on investment, a lot of great benefit using some kind of annotation tool. And if you're just getting started in NLP, you're probably asking, what's an annotation tool? So there's a lesson learned. All right, let's jump over into challenges. Some of the pain points and criticisms, critiques from customers effectively about the kinds of tools that are available. And in brief, accuracy is the top cited concern. Again, you see this a little bit more coming from respondents in general, slightly less so from people who are the practitioners. But we need to break that down because accuracy is a complex thing. Typically, people are referring to the effectiveness of how they're using NLP libraries. Keep in mind that NLP libraries are almost always some sort of multi-stage pipeline. And there are multiple models, typically pre-trained, that come along and do specific functions at the various stages. So when people describe problems in accuracy in NLP, mostly what they're talking about is this concatenation, this cascade of effects of different models at different stages and how well that works for them. For the uninitiated, they may not even be aware to the extent of how much they'll need to tune or customize any of those stages. So there's a lot that's being glommed together in terms of accuracy. Also, with respect to machine learning, The word accuracy is really loaded. I mean, in terms of machine learning, I could think of 5 different conflicting definitions, whether we're talking about perplexity or recall or precision, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no single metric for accuracy. It's a bit vague. Instead, it's a cumulative measure. It's a perception. Now, when we drill down, particularly looking at feedback from some of the larger organizations, the ones that have more documents, and also similarly looking at the practitioners, scalability is more crucial than speed. And we'll dig into that in a bit. But I should say, to try to unpack this point about scalability, NLP is a bit different. If we're talking about just straightforward data analytics, slicing and dicing log files, for instance, that's something that can be distributed, parallelized very effectively, and then aggregate, the counts, if you will. So those types of analytics functions are highly distributed. When we talk about NLP, typically you want to be working with a document as a unit of work so that you can preserve the context. And so it becomes more complex to achieve that kind of high scalability with NLP applications. And then compounding this, since late 2017, of course, there's been a lot of use of deep learning for the models in those NLP pipeline stages. And definitely that's had a lot of benefit in terms of accuracy overall, and it's opened up a much broader range of business use cases. On the other hand, it also introduces more complexity into this picture. So there's a lot of issues there about scalability. And now let's drill down, not just perceptions about the different tools, but really reports of pain points for the tools that you are using in production. So what are the main challenges there? And this is looking more again at the libraries, the open source. And I would call out to note the relative differences for the practitioners versus everyone else. Certainly accuracy is reported at the top, but then you're seeing scalability, integration, ease of use, functionality. And, so to summarize that, integration issues, language support, and scalability are the top 3 once we get past accuracy. I should definitely note that for NLP libraries, integration issues and lack of functionality, sometimes that can be addressed or is getting addressed by the extensibility of a library. How much can you go in and modify it, or maybe customize models, or do some sort of tuning in the pipelines? Again, that's something that people learn over time. Now, looking at what's being reported in terms of cloud services, again, I think it's interesting to take this contrast in terms of the technical leaders and the NLP practitioners. What they're reporting is that cost is the main issue, also functionality, accuracy, and privacy. And again, there's definitely a contrast between the initiated and the uninitiated. So this is good feedback for the NLP cloud services. Half of the respondents who use AWS Comprehend cited accuracy as their main challenge. And half the respondents who use Azure Text Analytics cited cost as their main challenge. If you're a product manager for NLP cloud services, you should definitely be taking notes right now. So yeah, cost is a leading issue with cloud services. These kinds of services get expensive as your collection of documents grows. Also, the practitioners, over a third of them cited that customizing is a key challenge. If you think of that in terms of the adoption curve, early on in your journey toward adopting NLP in production, maybe you faced these kinds of accuracy concerns. And then as you became more adept at working with NLP tools, you learned about more effective annotation and labeling, better feature engineering, how to customize models and adjust your pipelines. And perhaps maybe accuracy was not as much of the top challenge. Instead, you find that the services just don't fit the application. Now, language is very much application and domain specific, our usage of language in general. And so, once you get into this field, you find that you really need to go in and customize for specific production use cases. It becomes especially painful if a cloud service has targeted the typical usage of words and really can't recognize terms of art for a specific application. So case in point, if you're transcribing videos from conference talks, maybe a conference about DevOps, and most of the speakers are talking about Docker and they're talking about Kubernetes, and then your cloud service is translating that diligently into Docker and Kubernetes, and so the results are just something that you pretty much have to throw away, go over and redo it. And so overall, in terms of trends, we're definitely seeing a sketch for a kind of formula, if you will, for the business driver here of an approximate formula for what's driving NLP adoption in industry. And so the way that I would characterize it is, say, the breadth of industry use of NLP grows as the level of perceived accuracy increases. And that's especially true for use cases that must do some sort of understanding or text generation, which are, again, the more sophisticated ones these days. Growth in business applications, it's largely due to how NLP enhances automation and scale. And so if you can enable more of the complex kinds of applications, driving automation and scale and make those cost effective, then you get the breadth. So that's how these different issues tend to play together. Some of the industry sectors, of course, healthcare and finance, they've been using text mining for years, but more sophisticated approaches have been gaining traction. There's been a kind of renaissance since the mid-2010s, definitely since language models emerged on the scene in late 2017. We saw Elmo, Bert, Ernie, et cetera, all of Sesame Street show up with language models, and there's been just a flurry of activity on this. The other thing to keep in mind is how much hardware plays a driver in terms of business adoption. Arguably, hardware is evolving faster than software. And this is especially true when you're talking about machine learning accelerators, when you're talking about edge devices, low power, all of that. The question on the table is, to what extent will these factors sort of change the balance between, will it give cloud providers an edge for NLP cloud services? Will it make open source software more readily customizable for specific end use cases? That's not clear where that will tip, but hardware advances will definitely create surprises. So in closing, we have 4 points here. Definitely wanted to call out that I think are important takeaways from this picture overall. Number one is the sort of transformers über alles. The language models, also known as transformers, they're definitely compelling in terms of what they can do. They're largely about predicting the next item in a sequence, so sort of fill in the blank. Really useful for question and answer, really useful for abstractive summarization. But there are other important NLP use cases that they don't quite address. They don't really fit. They're also prohibitively large, obscenely expensive, high carbon footprint, relatively opaque, not the kind of thing that are going to make auditors happy. And even so, the cloud providers are just scrambling over each other to create larger and larger language models, hundreds of billions of parameters, approaching trillions. So we'll see where that goes. As somebody who's been working in AI for almost 40 years now, 4 decades, we've seen a long road to hoe in terms of the return on investment for semantics, but we're seeing that now, semantics and inference in particular. Text is considered semi-structured, but the semantics that are embedded in text are relatively structured. And that's especially true when you can tie it down to a specific domain. So when you get into legal contracts, insurance policies, patent applications, et cetera, you can really leverage the semantic part of this. And this is sort of the intersectionality of natural language and knowledge graph, which are, for instance, 2 of my main areas. We're seeing where NLP advances lead to AI apps that can leverage this embedded meaning. And especially if they're generating text summaries that can be consumed by both people and machines, this leads to broader adoption. So definitely watch that. There's a cloud dilemma, the tension between the cloud providers trying to do one-size-fits-all sorts of things, really monetizing their assets in terms of owning the AI teams, owning the public clouds, owning the large data sets. But they've been slow to respond to market needs and extensibility. And so they're perceived as high cost and low in accuracy, which is the exact opposite of what we're seeing as the business driver for breadth. And with that, there's just sort of this SaaS versus open source. There's a tension that persists between the one-size-fits-all thing versus the long-term effectiveness of open source, opening up a long tail. Looking ahead, I highly recommend checking out NLP Progress for seeing what's on the horizon of what will be moving from research into industry. The authors here, Ben and I, will be on Kindred to have a community discussion about the survey results. And you can pick up an online copy of this slide deck here on my site, Darwin AI. If you want to get a hold of me, here's where. Thank you very much.